the small coastal town of Seabrook was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. The salty air carried whispers of gossip from the docks to the cliffs, and the rhythmic crash of waves against the shore seemed to echo the town's unspoken judgments. For 28-year-old Clara Bennett, Seabrook had always been a sanctuary, a place where I could escape the chaos of my past. But now, it felt like a gilded cage. I had married Daniel Bennett 2 years ago, a man 10 years my senior. Daniel was steady, reliable, and kind, everything I thought I needed after a tumultuous relationship in my early 20s. He was a fisherman, like most men in Seabrook, with calloused hands and a sun-weathered face. He adored me, and I loved him in return, though sometimes I wondered if it was the kind of love that burned brightly or the kind that simply smoldered, warm and safe. Daniel's younger brother, Ethan Bennett, was another story entirely. Ethan was 30, only 2 years older than me, but he carried himself with a quiet intensity that made him seem older. He was the opposite of Daniel in almost every way, brooding where Daniel was cheerful, restless where Daniel was content. Ethan had left Seabrook at 18 to pursue a career in photography, traveling the world and capturing its raw beauty through his lens. He had returned only a year ago, after a failed engagement and a growing sense of rootlessness. From the moment I met Ethan, there was an unspoken tension between us. It wasn't anything I could put into words, just a flicker of something in his dark eyes when they met mine, a slight hesitation in his voice when he spoke to me. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things. But as the months passed, the tension only grew. It was a cool autumn evening when everything changed. Daniel was out on a fishing trip, as he often was, leaving me alone in a small cottage we shared on the edge of town. I had grown used to the solitude, filling my days with painting and long walks along the shore. But that night, the silence felt oppressive. I was in the middle of sketching when I heard a knock at the door. Startled, I set aside my charcoal and opened it to find Ethan standing on the porch, his camera slung over his shoulder and a bottle of wine in his hand. "Hey," he said, his voice low and slightly hesitant. "I was in the area and thought I'd stop by. Daniel mentioned you've been feeling a bit lonely." I hesitated, my heart inexplicably racing. "That's sweet of you. Come in." Ethan stepped inside, his presence immediately filling the small space. He set the wine on the table and glanced at my sketchpad. "You're an artist?" "Just a hobby," I replied, suddenly self-conscious. "I'm not very good." "Can I see?" he asked, his tone genuine. I nodded, handing him the sketchpad. He flipped through the pages, his expression unreadable. "These are incredible," he said finally. "You have a real talent." I felt a flush of warmth at his words. "Thank you. That means a lot, coming from you." We spent the next few hours talking about art, travel, life. Ethan told me about his time in Europe, the places he'd seen, the people he'd met. I found myself captivated by his stories, by the way his eyes lit up when he spoke about his passion. For the first time in months, I felt alive. As the night wore on, the wine bottle emptied, and the conversation grew more intimate. Ethan leaned back in his chair, studying me with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever feel like you're just going through the motions?" he asked. I hesitated, then nodded. "All the time." "I think that's why I came back to Seabrook," he admitted. "I thought maybe I could find some clarity here. But sometimes it feels like I'm just as lost as I was before." My heart ached at the vulnerability in his voice. "I know what you mean." Our eyes met, and for a moment, the air between us seemed to crackle with electricity. My breath caught in my throat as Ethan reached out, his fingers brushing against mine. The touch was fleeting, but it sent a jolt through me. "Clara," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. But before he could say more, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke the spell. I jumped to my feet, my heart pounding. That must be Daniel. Ethan stood as well, his expression unreadable. "I should go." I nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "Thanks for stopping by." As he left, I felt a strange mix of relief and regret. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just lonely. But deep down, I knew that something had shifted between us. In the weeks that followed, I found myself thinking about Ethan more and more. I tried to push the thoughts away, to focus on my marriage, but it was no use. Every time I saw him, the tension between us seemed to grow. Daniel, oblivious to the undercurrents, often invited Ethan over for dinner or to help with repairs around the house. I tried to act normal, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. I found myself stealing glances at Ethan when he wasn't looking, my heart racing whenever our hands accidentally brushed. One evening, after dinner, Daniel announced that he would be leaving on a week-long fishing trip. "Ethan's agreed to keep an eye on things while I'm gone," he said, smiling at his brother. "Make sure Clara doesn't get too lonely." My stomach twisted at the words, but I forced a smile. "That's not necessary. I'll be fine." "Nonsense," Daniel said, kissing me on the forehead. "I'll feel better knowing someone's here with you." After Daniel left, I tried to keep my distance from Ethan. But it was impossible. He seemed to be everywhere, fixing the leaky faucet in the kitchen, mowing the lawn, stopping by to check on me. And every time I saw him, the pull between us grew stronger. It was a stormy night when everything finally came to a head. The power had gone out, leaving the house in darkness. I was sitting by the fireplace, wrapped in a blanket, when Ethan arrived with a flashlight and a bottle of whiskey. "Thought you might need some company," he said, his voice soft. I nodded, my heart pounding. "Thanks." We sat by the fire, passing the bottle back and forth, the storm raging outside. The conversation flowed easily at first, but as the night wore on, it grew more intense. "Do you ever wonder if we're meant for something more?" Ethan asked, his eyes locked on mine. My breath caught. "What do you mean?" "I mean, this." He gestured between us. "Do you ever feel like there's something between us? Something we can't ignore?" My heart raced. "Ethan, we can't." "Why not?" he asked, his voice desperate. "I've tried to stay away, Clara. I've tried to respect the boundaries. But I can't keep pretending that I don't feel this way about you." My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, guilt, desire, fear. "This is wrong," I whispered. "Is it?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Or is it the most right thing we've ever felt?" Before I could respond, he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine. The kiss was tentative at first, but as the fire crackled and the storm raged outside, it deepened. I felt myself giving in, the weight of my guilt momentarily lifted by the intensity of the moment. But as we pulled away, reality came crashing down. My heart ached with the knowledge of what we had done, and what it meant for our future. In the days that followed, Ethan and I avoided each other, the weight of our actions hanging heavily between us. I felt torn. Part of me wanted to forget the kiss, to pretend it had never happened. But another part of me couldn't deny the connection I felt with Ethan. When Daniel returned, I tried to act normal, but the guilt was eating me alive. I knew I had to make a choice, to either confess my feelings and risk destroying my marriage, or to bury them and live with the regret. As I stood on the cliffs overlooking the ocean, the wind whipping through my hair, I realized that there were no easy answers. Love and lust, guilt and desire, they were all part of the same tide, pulling me in directions I couldn't control. And as the waves crashed against the rocks below, I wondered if I would ever find my way back to shore. The salt spray stung my face as I stood on the cliffs, the wind whipping my hair into a frenzy. The churning ocean mirrored the turmoil within me. Seabrook, my supposed sanctuary, now felt like a prison of my own making. Every crashing wave seemed to whisper accusations, echoing the guilt that gnawed at me. Daniel, my husband, my rock, was blissfully unaware of the storm brewing within our small cottage, a storm I had helped create. It had started subtly, a mere flicker of awareness in Ethan's dark eyes, a shared laugh that lingered a little too long. I had dismissed it then, attributing it to the small-town atmosphere, the close proximity of living. But as the months passed, the flicker grew into a flame, fueled by stolen glances and unspoken words. I told myself it was just loneliness, a yearning for connection in the quiet solitude of Daniel's fishing trips. But deep down, I knew it was more. It was Ethan's restless energy, his sharp wit, his passion for the world beyond Seabrook that drew me in. It was the contrast to Daniel's steady, predictable nature, a nature I had once craved, but now felt confining. The night Ethan had come over with wine, ostensibly out of concern for my loneliness, was a turning point. The air between us had crackled with unspoken desires, a dangerous current I knew I should resist, yet felt powerless to fight. His stories of far-off lands, his dreams of capturing the world's beauty through his lens, ignited a spark within me, a spark I thought had long been extinguished. He saw me, truly saw me, in a way Daniel, with his loving but familiar gaze, no longer did. The kiss, that single, stolen moment, had shattered the fragile dam I had built around my emotions. It was a transgression, a betrayal of Daniel's trust, and yet, in that instant, it felt right. It was a culmination of weeks, months, of unspoken longing, a release of the tension that had coiled between us. But the moment our lips parted, the weight of reality crashed down on me, heavier than any storm. The guilt was immediate, a cold, hard knot in my stomach. I had crossed a line I knew I could never fully erase. In the days that followed, Ethan and I became masters of avoidance. We moved around each other like dancers on a crowded floor, careful not to touch, careful not to meet each other's eyes. The silence between us was deafening, filled with the unspoken words, the lingering memory of the kiss. I yearned to talk to him, to confess, to understand what had happened between us. But fear held me back. Fear of Daniel's reaction, fear of the consequences, fear of what it would mean for my life, for all our lives. Daniel's return was a bittersweet relief. His warm embrace, his genuine smile, felt like a knife twisting in my heart. How could I face him, knowing what I had done? How could I pretend that everything was normal when my world had been irrevocably altered? I tried to bury my feelings, to be the dutiful wife, to focus on the mundane routines of our life. But Ethan's presence was a constant reminder, a shadow lurking in the corners of my mind. I found myself analyzing every interaction with Ethan, searching for hidden meanings in his words, reading more into his gestures than were probably there. Was he trying to communicate something to me? Was he regretting what had happened? Or was he, like me, simply trying to survive the awkward dance of our shared secret? One afternoon, I found Ethan in his makeshift darkroom, the red light casting an eerie glow on his face. He was surrounded by photographs, images of windswept landscapes, faces etched with time and experience, moments captured and frozen in time. I hesitated at the door, unsure whether to intrude. "These are beautiful," I said softly, stepping into the room. Ethan looked up, startled. Thanks, he replied, his voice guarded. We stood in silence for a moment, the only sound the gentle hum of the developing equipment. I couldn't help but notice the weariness in his eyes, the shadows under his cheekbones. He looked as haunted as I felt. Ethan, I began, my voice trembling slightly. About that night. He held up a hand, stopping me. Don't, he said, his voice low. Don't say anything. We both know what happened. We both know it was a mistake. Was it? I whispered, the question hanging in the air between us. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of longing and regret. It shouldn't have happened, he said finally. We can't do this again, Clara. I nodded, tears stinging my eyes. I know, I said, my voice barely audible. But even as I said the words, a part of me questioned their truth. Could we really go back to the way things were before? Could we erase the memory of that kiss, the feeling of his arms around me, the whisper of his breath against my skin? The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. The tension between Ethan and me remained, a constant undercurrent in our interactions. We were polite, civil, but there was a distance, a chasm that had opened between us. I tried to focus on my marriage, to be the wife Daniel deserved. But the guilt was always there, a constant reminder of my betrayal. One evening, Daniel announced he was planning another fishing trip, a longer one this time, a month at sea. My stomach clenched at the news. A month alone in the small cottage, with only my thoughts, with only the memories of Ethan. The prospect was both terrifying and, strangely, exciting. As Daniel prepared for his departure, I found myself drawn to Ethan. I would make excuses to talk to him, to be near him, even for a few stolen moments. We talked about everything and nothing, avoiding the one topic that hung heavy between us. But the unspoken words, the lingering glances, betrayed the truth of our feelings. The night before Daniel left, I found Ethan on the cliffs, his camera pointed towards the vast expanse of the ocean. The moon was full, casting a silvery glow on the water. I walked towards him, my heart pounding in my chest. It's beautiful, I said, standing beside him. He nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Yeah, he said softly. It is. We stood in silence for a moment, the only sound the crashing waves and the gentle breeze. Then Ethan turned to me, his eyes searching mine. Clara, he began, his voice barely a whisper. He hesitated, as if unsure what to say. I reached out and touched his arm, a fleeting gesture, a silent acknowledgement of the feelings that still lingered between us. Don't, I whispered, my voice choked with emotion. Don't say anything. He nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. We stood there for a long moment, bathed in the moonlight, the unspoken words hanging heavy in the air between us. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away, leaving me alone with my thoughts, with the crashing waves, with the storm that still raged within me. And as I watched him disappear into the darkness, I knew that the tide was turning, pulling me further and further away from the shore, into the depths of the unknown.